It was a scandal that should have destroyed the House of Blackwood. Imagine the scene. A thunderstorm raging over the English moors in 1842. The most powerful man in the county, the Marquess of Oakhaven, stands on the doorstep of a poor, grieving widow. He is soaked to the bone, holding a bundle that is crying for its life. He looks the woman in the eye and delivers a line that would change history. He is my son, but he is not my wife's. Who was the mother? Why did the Marquess choose a peasant woman to hide the heir to his fortune? And what happens when the Marquess's cruel, barren wife finds out? This is the true, untold story of the Blackwood heir. Buckle up. This one is full of betrayal. The rain in Derbyshire did not wash things clean. It merely turned the world into a slurry of grey mud and freezing damp. It was late November, 1842. Inside the small, thatched cottage at the edge of the Blackwood estate, the fire in the hearth was dying, much like the hope in Tess Miller's heart. Tess sat in the rocking chair, her hands gripping the wooden arms so tightly her knuckles were white. The cottage was silent. Too silent. 3 days ago, the cries of her newborn daughter, Alice, had filled this room. Now, there was only the sound of the wind rattling the loose shutter. Alice was buried in the churchyard, taken by a fever that swept through the village infants like a scythe. Tess's husband, John, had died in a mining accident 6 months prior. At 22, Tess Miller was entirely alone in the world. She stared into the embers, contemplating the bottle of laudanum on the table. It would be so easy to sleep. Bang, bang, bang. The heavy pounding on the door made her jump. It wasn't a neighborly knock. It was desperate, authoritative. Tess stood, her legs trembling. "Who is it? Open the door, Mrs. Miller. Now!" The voice was deep, commanding, and terrifyingly familiar. Tess pulled the heavy iron bolt and cracked the door open. The wind ripped it from her grasp, slamming it against the wall. Standing in the deluge was a figure wrapped in a heavy, oilskin cloak. Lightning flashed, illuminating the sharp, angular features of Lord Alistair Blackwood, the Marquess of Oakhaven. He was a man of 35, known for his cold demeanour in Parliament and his ruthless management of the estate. But tonight, his eyes were wide, his black hair plastered to his forehead, and he was gasping for breath. "My lord." Tess dropped into a clumsy curtsy, panic rising. I have no rent money. I told the steward." "Hang the rent," Alistair growled. He stepped inside, kicking the door shut behind him. He carried a bundle inside his cloak, shielding it with his own body. He walked to the hearth, looking around the meagre room. "Are you alone?" "Yes, my lord." "Good." He turned to her, and for the first time, the Marquess of Oakhaven looked vulnerable. He began to unbutton his heavy cloak. From the warmth of his chest, he pulled a bundle wrapped in expensive, water-stained silk. A cry pierced the air, a thin, reedy wail of a newborn. Tess's heart stopped. Her milk, unspent and painful in her chest, seemed to burn at the sound. "A baby?" Alistair looked down at the child, his expression a war between devastation and fierce protectiveness. "He was born 3 hours ago. He needs food. He needs a mother." Tess took a step back. "My lord, surely Lady Rosalind." Alistair's head snapped up. His eyes were like flint. "Lady Rosalind is at the manor, asleep. She knows nothing of this." He stepped forward and thrust the bundle toward Tess. "Take him." "My lord, I cannot. I just buried my own—" "I know," Alistair said, his voice softening, though the urgency remained. "I know you lost your daughter, Tess. And I am sorry. But if you do not take this boy, he will die. Or he will be killed." "Killed," Tess whispered, reaching out instinctively. Her arms felt the weight of the child. and a jolt of electricity went through her. The baby was tiny, shivering. "He is my son," Alistair said, the words hanging heavy in the damp air. "But he is not my wife's." Tess looked down at the infant. He had a tuft of black hair, just like the Marquess. But his eyes, even in the dim light, they looked different. "Who?" Tess started to ask, but stopped. "His mother is dead," Alistair said, turning away to stare into the fire. "She died mere moments after he drew breath. She was everything to me." Tess rocked the baby, her maternal instincts overriding her confusion. The boy rooted against her chest, hungry. "Why me?" Tess asked quietly. Alistair turned back. "Because you are the only woman in this village with milk who isn't a gossip monger. Because your husband was a good man who saved my horses once. And because right now we both have nothing but grief." He reached into his sodden coat and pulled out a heavy leather pouch. He slammed it onto the table. It clinked with the heavy sound of gold sovereigns. "There is £500 in there," Alistair said. Tess gasped. That was more money than the entire village saw in a decade. "You will raise him as your own," Alistair commanded, slipping back into his cold, aristocratic mask. "You will tell the village that you found a foundling on the church steps, or that a cousin from York sent him. I don't care what lie you spin, as long as it is believable. His name is William." "William?" Tess repeated, looking at the boy. He had stopped crying, comforted by her warmth. "If Lady Rosalind finds out who he is," Alistair said, moving to the door, "she will destroy us all. Do you understand, Tess?" "I understand," she whispered. The Marquess paused with his hand on the latch. He looked back at the baby one last time, a look of such profound longing that Tess felt like an intruder. Then, without another word, he opened the door and vanished into the storm. Tess Miller looked down at the gold, then at the boy. She sat back in the rocking chair, unbuttoned her bodice, and let the son of the Marquess feed. The following morning, Blackwood Manor stood imposing and grey against the clearing sky. It was a sprawling estate of stone and ivy, a place that projected power but lacked warmth. In the morning room, Lady Rosalind Blackwood sat at a mahogany table, peeling a hard-boiled egg with the precision of a surgeon. She was a striking woman, tall, with hair the colour of pale straw and eyes of ice blue. She was the daughter of the Earl of Harrington, a match made for dynasty, not affection. Rosalind had been pregnant 3 times in their 7 years of marriage. 3 times the cradles remained empty. The doctors whispered of a hostile womb, a phrase that made Rosalind want to burn the world down. She channeled her bitterness into absolute control over the household. "The Marquess returned late last night," Rosalind said, not looking up from her plate. Silas, the elderly butler who had served the Blackwoods for 40 years, poured her tea. His hand did not shake. "Yes, my lady. The storm was severe. Lord Alistair was inspecting the drainage in the lower fields." "The lower fields," Rosalind repeated, slicing the egg. "In a thunderstorm. How diligent." The doors opened, and Alistair entered. He was dressed impeccably in a charcoal frock coat, showing no signs of the muddy, desperate man he had been hours prior. However, there were dark circles under his eyes. "Good morning, Rosalind," he said, taking his seat at the opposite end of the long table. "You look dreadful, Alistair," she noted, sipping her tea. "Did the drainage issues require so much physical exertion?" Alistair unfolded his napkin. "The flooding threatens the tenant cottages. It is my duty to ensure their safety." "You care too much for the peasantry," Rosalind scoffed. "They are like weeds. They always grow back." Alistair's jaw tightened, but he remained silent. "There is news from the village this morning," Rosalind continued, her eyes locking onto his. "My maid, Goethe, tells me the widow Miller, the one whose husband died in the mine, has taken in a foundling." Alistair didn't flinch. He buttered his toast with steady hands. "Is that so?" "Curious timing," Rosalind mused. She lost her own brat just days ago. And now, miraculously, another appears? Goethe says the baby was wrapped in fine linen, finer than a miner's widow could afford. Alistair took a bite of toast, chewing slowly. "Perhaps charity is not dead in Derbyshire, Rosalind, even if it is absent in this dining room." Rosalind slammed her silverware down. "Do not lecture me on charity. I am the one who organizes the church bazaar. I am the one who maintains the reputation of this family while you run around in the mud." She stood up, walking slowly toward him. She placed a hand on his shoulder. Her fingers were cold. "I know you, Alistair. I know you have been distant these past months, disappearing to London, late nights riding." She leaned down, whispering in his ear. "If I find out you have been unfaithful, if I find out you have shamed me to sire a bastard because I could not give you an heir, I will ensure that neither the whore nor the child survives the winter." Alistair turned to look at her. "You let your imagination run wild, Rosalind. It does not become you." "We shall see," she said, straightening up. "I think I shall pay a visit to the village today. I need to deliver blankets to the poor. It is the Christian thing to do, and I should like to see this miracle baby." Alistair's blood ran cold. "The roads are still muddy. You will ruin your carriage." "I will take the gig. I am not made of sugar, Alistair." She swept out of the room, her silk skirts rustling like dry leaves. Alistair waited until the door clicked shut. He dropped his head into his hands, exhaling a shaky breath. "Silas." The butler stepped out of the shadows. "My lord." "Send a rider to the village. Take the shortcut through the woods. Tell Tess Miller that the wolf is coming." Silas nodded solemnly. "At once, my lord." Tess had barely 10 minutes between Silas's breathless warning and the sound of carriage wheels grinding against the gravel outside her cottage. Silas, the old butler, had been trembling as he delivered the message. "Hide the money, lass. Hide the linen he came in. And for the love of God, do not look her in the eye for too long. She smells fear like a hound." Tess had shoved the heavy pouch of gold and the fine embroidered silk blanket into a hollow beneath the floorboards, covering it with a ragged rug and her sewing basket. She wrapped William in rough wool, the kind a miner's son would wear. When the knock came, it was sharp and rhythmic, the tip of a parasol rapping against the wood. Tess opened the door. The rain had stopped, but the air remained damp. Lady Rosalind Blackwood stood there, flanked by 2 footmen. She looked entirely out of place, a vision of velvet and disdain against the backdrop of the muddy village. "Mrs. Miller," Rosalind said, her voice smooth as glass. "May I come in?" It was not a request. Tess stepped aside, bowing her head. "My lady, it is an honor." Rosalind swept into the small room. She held a scented handkerchief to her nose, her eyes darting around the space, cataloguing the poverty, the single pot on the stove, the peeling plaster, the drying herbs hanging from the rafters. "I heard of your tragedy," Rosalind said, though her tone lacked any warmth. "And then I heard of your good fortune. A foundling, they say." "Yes, my lady," Tess said, standing between Rosalind and the wooden cradle. "A cousin from York. She died in childbirth, unwed. Her family turned the babe away. I was the only kin who would take him." "York," Rosalind repeated, walking slowly toward the cradle. "A long journey for a newborn." He must be a sturdy thing. She reached the cradle and used the tip of her gloved finger to pull back the wool blanket. William was sleeping, his dark lashes fanning against his pale cheeks. Rosalind stared at him. The room went deathly silent. Tess held her breath, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "He is handsome," Rosalind murmured, a strange tightness in her voice. "Dark hair, high cheekbones." She leaned closer. "He does not look like a peasant, Mrs. Miller. His father was a soldier, they say." Tess lied, the backstory Alistair had helped her construct racing through her mind. "An officer." Rosalind reached out, her hand hovering over the baby's face. For a terrifying second, Tess thought she might hurt him, but Rosalind merely traced the line of the baby's jaw. Suddenly, William's eyes flew open. He stared up at the strange woman, his eyes wide and dark. Rosalind gasped and recoiled, as if she had been burned. She stumbled back, her face draining of color. "My lady?" Tess stepped forward. "Those eyes," Rosalind whispered to herself. She looked at Tess, her composure snapping back into place, though her hands were shaking. "He has unsettling eyes." She turned away from the cradle, pacing the room. "My husband, the Marquess, has a bleeding heart for the plight of his tenants. He tells me I should be more charitable." Rosalind signaled to one of the footmen, who stepped forward and placed a basket on the table. "Bread, cheese, a few blankets," Rosalind said. "Do not think this makes us friends, Mrs. Miller. I simply do not wish for a child to starve on my husband's land. It reflects poorly on the estate." "Thank you, my lady," Tess said. Rosalind moved to the door, but she paused at the threshold. She didn't look back. "York is a large city, Mrs. Miller. I have many acquaintances there. If I were to inquire about your cousin, would I find a record of her?" Tess dug her fingernails into her palms. "Her name was Mary. She lived in the slums, my lady. People like us. We don't often leave records." Rosalind stood still for a moment, absorbing the defiance. "No," she said softly. "I suppose you don't. You just appear and disappear." With a rustle of skirts, she was gone. Tess waited until the carriage faded into the distance. She ran to the door, locked it, and then collapsed onto the floor beside the cradle, sobbing. She knew, with a mother's instinct, that the danger had not passed. It had only just begun. 6 years later, 1848. Time moves differently for the rich and the poor. For the Blackwoods, the years were marked by cold silences and lavish empty parties. For Tess and William, the years were marked by growth, by the changing seasons, and by a love that was fierce and protective. William, or Will as the village boys called him, grew into a wild, spirited child. He had the energy of a storm. He was quick-witted, startlingly intelligent, and possessed a natural authority that baffled the other village children. When Will suggested a game, they played it. When he led, they followed. Tess had used the gold carefully. She repaired the roof, bought a milk cow, and ensured Will had books. She taught him to read by candlelight, and when her own knowledge ran dry, she paid the village priest to tutor him. But keeping him a secret was becoming impossible. It was a crisp autumn afternoon. The Blackwood estate was hosting the annual harvest fair, one of the few days when the tenants were allowed onto the lower grounds of the manor. "Stay close to me, Will," Tess warned, adjusting the collar of his rough-spun shirt. "And do not look at the gentry. Keep your head down." "Why?" Will asked, his green eyes flashing. "Are they better than us?" "They are powerful, Will. Power is dangerous." But a 6-year-old boy is driven by curiosity, not caution. While Tess was distracted buying apples, Will saw a hound, a magnificent Irish wolfhound, trotting toward the edge of the manicured gardens. Entranced, Will slipped away from the crowd and followed the dog. He found himself in a part of the estate he had never seen, the private rose gardens. The hedges were high, cutting off the noise of the fair. The dog stopped in front of a stone bench where a man sat, reading a book. Will froze. He knew who the man was. Everyone knew the Marquess. He was the tall, dark figure who rode the black stallion through the village, the man the mothers hushed their children for. The dog barked. Alistair looked up. For a moment, the Marquess and the village boy stared at one another. Alistair's book lowered slowly. He looked at the boy, the messy black hair, the sharp jaw that was a mirror of his own, and the eyes. The eyes were not Alistair's. They were hers. They were Cecilia's eyes. "You are far from the fair, lad," Alistair said, his voice unusually gentle. Will straightened his back. He didn't cower. "I was following the dog, sir." He looked lonely. Alistair's lips twitched with a ghost of a smile. "He is not lonely. He is solitary. There is a difference." "I'm William," the boy said, stepping forward. Alistair's heart hammered. He knew. Of course he knew. He had watched the boy from afar for 6 years, receiving weekly reports from Silas. But seeing him up close, hearing his voice, it was a physical blow. "I know who you are," Alistair said. "Tess Miller's boy." "That's me." Will reached out to pet the hound. "Is this your dog?" "His name is Barnaby." "Barnaby." Will tested the name. "He's a good boy, strong." Alistair watched his son's small hand buried in the dog's fur. He wanted to reach out, to pull the boy into his arms, to claim him, but the shadow of the manor loomed over them. "Do you like horses, William?" Alistair asked suddenly. "I love them, but we only have a cow." Alistair reached into his pocket and pulled out a silver coin. "Take this. Go to the stables near the fairgrounds. Tell the groom, old Thomas, that Lord Blackwood says you are to have a pony ride, as many as you like." Will's eyes went wide. He took the coin. "Truly?" "Truly. Now go, before you are missed." Will grinned, a bright, infectious smile that transformed his face. "Thank you, my lord." He turned and ran back toward the hedge maze. Alistair watched him go, a lump in his throat. He stayed on the bench, gripping the book until his knuckles turned white. He did not see the figure standing on the balcony above the garden. Lady Rosalind stood behind the stone balustrade, her face hidden by the shadow of a parasol. She had seen it all. She had seen the interaction. She had seen the way Alistair looked at the boy, not with the indifference of a landlord, but with the longing of a father. And she had seen the boy's face. She lowered her opera glasses. Her hands were trembling, not with fear this time, but with a cold crystallization of rage. "It wasn't a cousin from York," she whispered to the empty air. She turned and walked back into her bedroom. She went to her writing desk and unlocked a hidden drawer. Inside was a stack of letters she had intercepted years ago. Letters from a woman named Cecilia to her husband. She had thought the affair ended with Cecilia's death. She had thought she had won. But now she realized the affair had left a legacy. Rosalind rang the bell. Goethe, her sour-faced maid, appeared instantly. "Goethe," Rosalind said, staring at her reflection in the mirror, "I have a job for you. I need you to go to London. There is a man there, a Mr. Sharp. He specializes in solving problems that require discretion." "What sort of problems, my lady?" Rosalind picked up a silver hairbrush. "We have a weed in the garden, Goethe. It has been allowed to grow for 6 years. It is time it was plucked." 2 weeks later, the attack did not come with a dagger in the dark, but with a piece of paper and the heavy boots of the law. Lady Rosalind's hired hand, a man named Leonard Creech, was a creature of the London underworld who wore the suit of a gentleman, but possessed the soul of a rat. He had spent a week in the village, watching the cottage, observing Tess's routine, and planting the seeds of destruction. It was a Tuesday evening. Tess was kneading dough for the morning bread, William sitting at the table reading aloud from a battered copy of Robinson Crusoe. The domestic peace was shattered when the door burst open. The village magistrate, Mr. Higgins, a pompous man who owed his position entirely to the Blackwood family, strode in, flanked by 2 constables, and Leonard Creech. "Tess Miller," Higgins announced, puffing out his chest. "You are under arrest." Tess wiped her flour-dusted hands on her apron, stepping in front of William instantly. "Arrest? For what? I have paid my rent." "Not for debt, woman. For theft," Higgins spat. Creech stepped forward, a oily smile playing on his lips. "Lady Rosalind has reported a missing item, a ruby brooch of immense value. She recalled that you were in the kitchens delivering herbs 2 days ago." "I was never near her jewelry," Tess cried, her voice rising in panic. "I left the herbs with the cook at the back door." "We shall see," Higgins said. He nodded to the constables. "Search the place." The men tore the small cottage apart. They overturned the mattress, smashed the few plates Tess owned, and ripped the drying herbs from the ceiling. William screamed, clinging to Tess's skirts. "Leave it be! You're scaring him!" Tess shouted, trying to push a constable away. "Found it!" One of the constables stood by the flour bin. He reached inside and pulled out a glittering object, a brooch shaped like a rose, encrusted with rubies. Tess stared at it in horror. "That! I have never seen that in my life. You put it there." She pointed at Creech. "He put it there." "Silence!" Higgins roared. "Caught red-handed. The penalty for theft of this magnitude is transportation to the colonies." "Or hanging." "No!" Tess screamed as they grabbed her arms. "My son! What about my son?" Creech stepped forward, placing a hand on William's shoulder. The boy bit him. Creech yelped, but clamped his hand down harder, digging his fingers into the boy's collarbone. "The boy is a ward of the parish now," Creech said smoothly. "Since you are unfit, Lady Rosalind has graciously offered to arrange for his education." "Do not touch him." Tess fought like a wild animal, kicking and scratching, but the constables were too strong. They dragged her out into the cold night air, throwing her into the back of the wagon. Through the wooden slats, she saw Creech dragging a kicking, screaming William toward a black carriage that waited in the shadows. "William!" Tess screamed, her voice tearing her throat raw. "Run! Run to the woods!" But the carriage door slammed shut. The whip cracked. Tess collapsed against the dirty floor of the paddy wagon as it rumbled toward the county jail. The image of her son's terrified face burned into her mind. The trap had been perfect, and there was no one left to save them. Alistair Blackwood had been in London for 3 days on parliamentary business. He returned to Oakhaven late on Thursday, exhausted and longing for the quiet of the country. He sensed the wrongness the moment he stepped into the foyer. The house was too quiet. The servants would not meet his eyes. "Silas!" Alistair barked, handing his coat to a footman. The old butler appeared from the hallway. He looked 10 years older than he had when Alistair left. His face was pale, his hands shaking. "My lord," Silas whispered. "Thank God you are home." "What has happened? Where is Lady Rosalind?" "My lady is in the dining room, having supper. But, my lord, you must know. Mrs. Miller has been arrested." Alistair froze. "Arrested? For what?" "Theft. A brooch was found in her flour bin. She is in the county lockup, awaiting trial." Alistair's blood ran cold. "And the boy, where is William?" Silas swallowed hard. "Mr. Creech, a man my lady hired, took the boy. They said he was being taken to the St. Jude's Home for Foundlings in London. But what, Silas? Alistair grabbed the old man's lapels. But the carriage did not go toward the London road, my lord. The stable boy saw them turn toward the coast, toward the docks at Liverpool. The realization hit Alistair like a physical blow. The docks. They weren't sending him to an orphanage. They were shipping him out, to the colonies, or into the navy as a powder monkey, or simply to be dumped in a foreign slum to die. "Saddle Notros," Alistair ordered, his voice terrifyingly calm. "And get my pistols." "My lord!" "Do it!" Alistair roared, the sound echoing off the marble walls. He turned and marched toward the dining room. He kicked the double doors open with such force that they banged against the walls. Rosalind sat at the end of the long table, sipping wine. She looked up, unbothered. "Alistair, you're back early. I wasn't expecting you until tomorrow." Alistair walked down the length of the table. He didn't stop until he was standing over her. He looked down at his wife, seeing her clearly for the first time, not just as cold, but as evil. "Where is he?" Alistair asked. "I assume you mean the peasant thief. She is in jail where she belongs. I recovered my ruby brooch, you'll be pleased to know." Alistair slammed his fist onto the table, shattering a crystal wine glass. Wine bled across the white tablecloth like a fresh wound. "Do not play games with me, Rosalind. I am talking about the boy. Where is William?" Rosalind dabbed her mouth with a napkin. "The bastard. I disposed of him." The air left the room. Rosalind stood up, her blue eyes flashing with venom. "Did you think I didn't know? Did you think I was blind? I saw him in the garden. He has your face, Alistair. He has that whore's eyes. He is an innocent child. He is an insult," Rosalind screamed, losing her composure at last. "I am the daughter of an earl. I have given you my life, my dowry, my name, and you shame me with a village brat? You look at him with more love in one glance than you have shown me in 10 years. Because he has a heart," Alistair shouted back. "Something you ripped out of your chest long ago. It doesn't matter," Rosalind sneered, regaining her icy armor. "He is gone. Creech has instructions. The boy is on a ship bound for the West Indies. He will work the sugar plantations. If he survives the voyage." Alistair stared at her. The rage that filled him was so pure, so white hot, that his vision blurred. "You have made a grave mistake, Rosalind," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You thought to protect your position. Instead, you have just forfeited it. You cannot touch me. I am your wife." "Not for long." Alistair turned on his heel. "Where are you going?" Rosalind demanded, a flicker of fear finally entering her voice. "Alistair, it is a storm outside. You cannot chase a carriage in this." "If I do not find him," Alistair said, stopping at the door, "do not be here when I return." He ran out into the night. Silas was waiting with Notros, the black stallion, and a brace of loaded pistols. "The carriage had a 6-hour head start, my lord," Silas said, handing him the reins. "But it is heavy, and the roads are mud. Notros is fast." Alistair mounted the horse. The rain began to fall, cold and hard. "Pray for us, Silas," Alistair said. He kicked the stallion into a gallop, thundering out of the estate gates, riding not as a Marquess, but as a father. He had lost Cecilia. He would not lose her son, even if he had to burn the world down to find him. The world had reduced itself to the brutal rhythm of hooves striking mud and the roar of the wind in the trees. The storm that hammered Derbyshire was not merely weather. It felt like a biblical judgment, a deluge sent to wash away the sins of the House of Blackwood. Alistair Blackwood, the Marquess of Oakhaven, rode with the desperation of a man who had already died once. He had died 6 years ago, in a birthing bed next to the woman he loved, when he handed their son to a stranger. Tonight, he rode to resurrect that ghost. Notros, his great black stallion, was a beast of immense power, but even he was faltering. The road to the coast was a treacherous ribbon of slurry. Twice the horse stumbled, his knees buckling in the clay, and twice Alistair hauled him up with a roar that was lost to the thunder, driving his heels into the animal's flanks. "Forgive me, old friend," Alistair whispered into the horse's wet mane, his face stung by needles of freezing rain. "But we cannot stop. We cannot." His mind was a torment of images. He saw William's face, the boy who had looked at him in the rose garden with such open curiosity. He saw the trust in those eyes, eyes that belonged to Cecilia. If I lose him, Alistair thought, the icy dread pooling in his stomach, I will burn England to the ground. He had spent 6 years protecting his title, his reputation, and the fragile peace of his loveless marriage to Rosalind. He had thought he was being noble. He had thought he was protecting William from the stigma of illegitimacy. But as the lightning illuminated the twisted skeletal branches of the oaks lining the road, Alistair realized the truth. He hadn't been protecting William. He had been protecting himself. He had been a coward, hiding his heart in a peasant's cottage while he played the lord in a cold stone castle. No more. "Faster!" Alistair screamed, the wind tearing the word from his throat. They crested the ridge that overlooked the River Dart. Usually the river was a placid stream, a place for trout fishing and lazy summer afternoons. Tonight it was a raging torrent, swollen black and brown, chewing at the banks. And there, 300 yards ahead, the nightmare materialized. The bridge, an old wooden structure that had stood since his grandfather's time, was gone. Shattered by the floodwaters, its timbers were being carried downstream like matchsticks, and stranded on the near bank, its wheels mired deep in the sodden earth, was the black carriage. Alistair reined Notros in, the horse sliding a dozen feet in the mud before coming to a halt, chest heaving, foam flying from his bit. Alistair didn't wait for the beast to settle. He slid from the saddle, his boots sinking ankle-deep into the freezing mire. He drew the heavy flintlock pistol from his belt, shielding the firing mechanism with his coat. The scene before him was chaotic. The carriage horses were screaming, tangling in their traces. 2 men were struggling in the rain, Leonard Creech and the driver. They were dragging something small and struggling from the carriage. A boat. Alistair saw it now. A small, flat-bottomed skiff was tethered to a willow tree near the rushing water, bobbing violently in the current. They weren't waiting for the bridge. They were going to cross the flood. "Creech!" The name ripped out of Alistair's chest, loud enough to cut through the roar of the water. Leonard Creech spun around. He was a rat of a man, soaking wet, his expensive city coat ruined. He held a lantern in one hand, the glass cracked, the flame sputtering. In his other hand, he gripped the collar of a small boy. William. The boy was limp, his feet dragging in the mud, clearly exhausted from fighting. But when he heard the voice, his head snapped up. "Let him go," Alistair said. He walked forward, steady and slow, a predator closing in. "Step away from the boy, Creech. This ends now." Creech squinted into the darkness, then laughed, a sharp, hysterical sound. "The Marquess. I told Lady Rosalind you were too soft to chase us in a storm. Seems I was wrong." I said, "Let him go." Alistair raised the pistol. His hand was rock steady. "I can't do that, my lord," Creech shouted over the wind. "I have a contract. The boy goes to the Indies. Or, well, if the boat capsizes in this water, who's to say it wasn't a tragic accident?" He dragged William closer to the raging river. The boy cried out, a small, terrified sound that shattered Alistair's heart. "Don't!" Alistair took a step closer. "You want money? I will give you double what she paid. Triple." "Money isn't the issue, Lord Blackwood," Creech sneered, backing toward the skiff. "It's reputation. Lady Rosalind was very clear. The weed must be plucked. And frankly, if I let him go now, you'll hang me for kidnapping. My only chance is to finish the job." Creech nodded to the driver, a burly, scarred brute of a man who had been struggling with the horses. The driver pulled a long, curved knife from his boot and stepped between Alistair and Creech. "Kill him!" Creech ordered, dragging William toward the boat. The driver lunged. Alistair didn't hesitate. He didn't think about honor or fair play. He aimed at the center of the driver's chest and pulled the trigger. Click. The powder was wet. The gun misfired. The driver grinned, revealing rotting teeth, and charged. Alistair threw the useless pistol at the man's face. The heavy iron struck the driver on the cheekbone with a sickening crack, staggering him for a second. That second was all Alistair needed. He didn't fight like a Marquess. He fought like a father. He collided with the driver, driving his shoulder into the man's gut. They hit the mud with a splash, rolling in the filth. The knife slashed out, slicing through the sleeve of Alistair's coat, biting into his forearm. Alistair didn't feel the pain. He slammed his forehead into the driver's nose, once, twice, blinding the man with pain. He grabbed the man's wrist, twisting it with a savage snap until the knife fell into the mud. Alistair delivered a final, brutal hook to the jaw, and the driver went limp, sliding face down into the muck. Alistair scrambled up, gasping for air, mud sealing one eye shut. He looked toward the river. Creech was in the boat. He had thrown William into the bottom of the skiff and was untying the rope. The current was grabbing the small craft, pulling it violently away from the bank. "No!" Alistair screamed. He didn't think. He ran. He sprinted across the slick grass and launched himself off the bank just as the boat tore free. He hit the water. The cold was paralyzing, 1,000 daggers piercing his skin. The current seized him instantly, dragging him downstream. He flailed, his hand catching the gunwale of the boat. "Get off!" Creech screamed, grabbing an oar and smashing it down on Alistair's fingers. Bone crunched. Alistair cried out but didn't let go. He hauled himself up, the river trying to suck him under. He hooked his leg over the side of the skiff, tipping it dangerously. Creech raised the oar for a killing blow to the head. But he had forgotten the boy. As Creech raised his arms, William, terrified, freezing, 6-year-old William, scrambled up from the floorboards and sank his teeth into Creech's calf. Creech howled, stumbling backward. The boat rocked violently. He lost his balance, his arms flailing, and tumbled backward over the side of the skiff into the churning black water. He surfaced once, screaming for help, before the current caught him, spinning him away into the darkness. Then he was gone. Alistair hauled himself into the boat, collapsing onto the wet wood. He was gasping, shivering uncontrollably, blood dripping from his arm and his crushed fingers. The boat was spinning, drifting downstream, but the water here was calmer, widening out as the river bent. Alistair crawled toward the huddled shape in the bow. "William!" he choked out. The boy was curled into a ball, shaking so hard his teeth rattled. He looked up, his eyes wide and dark, filled with a terror no child should ever know. "My lord?" William whispered. Alistair reached out, his hand trembling, and touched the boy's cheek. "No, not my lord, not any more." He pulled the wet, muddy child into his arms. He held him with a ferocity that defied the storm. He rocked him, burying his face in the boy's sodden hair, smelling the river and the fear and the life. "It's Papa!" Alistair sobbed, the tears mixing with the rain on his face. "I'm your Papa, William, and I have you. I swear to God, I have you." William didn't pull away. He didn't ask how or why. He simply buried his face in Alistair's ruined coat and wept, his small hands clutching the lapels as if holding on to the only solid thing in the universe. The storm raged on, but inside the small, drifting boat, there was finally peace. The morning after, the transformation of the Marquess of Oakhaven was the talk of the county for generations. When Alistair rode back into the village the next morning, he did not look like a peer of the realm. He was riding Notros, who was caked in mud. Alistair was hatless, his fine coat torn and blooded, his hand bandaged with a strip of his own shirt, and seated in front of him on the saddle, wrapped in Alistair's dry vest, was William. They rode straight to the county jail. The townsfolk stopped in the streets, gaping. Alistair ignored them. He rode with his head high, his arm wrapped protectively around his son. He didn't tie the horse. He slid down, lifted William gently to the ground, and marched to the heavy oak doors. He didn't knock. He kicked the door with a muddy boot. The jailer, a man named Thomas, opened the peep hatch. "Here now, what's the— Oh, my lord!" The bolts were drawn back instantly. Alistair strode into the office, where Magistrate Higgins was sipping his morning tea. Higgins looked up and dropped his cup. It shattered, splattering tea across his desk. "Lord Blackwood, good heavens, man, you look like you've been to war." "I have," Alistair said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated in the small room. "And I have won." He walked to the desk, leaning his fists on the wood. "You have a prisoner, Tess Miller. You are holding her on charges of theft brought by my wife." "Yes, my lord," Higgins stammered, intimidated by the raw violence radiating from the Marquess. "The brooch. Lady Rosalind was quite specific." "Lady Rosalind," Alistair interrupted, "is a liar." The room went silent. To call one's wife a liar in public was unthinkable. "The brooch was planted," Alistair said, his eyes boring into Higgins. "My wife hired a man named Leonard Creech to frame an innocent woman and kidnap this child." He gestured to William, who stood by his side, holding Alistair's coat-tail. "Creech has confessed. The river has taken him. But his confession stands." It was a lie. Creech had died screaming, but Alistair delivered it with the absolute conviction of his station. "Kidnap?" Higgins paled. "But surely. Open the cell, Higgins, or I will tear this building down brick by brick to get her out, and then I will go to the Home Secretary and explain why you were complicit in the abduction of a child." Higgins fumbled for the keys, his hands shaking so hard they jingled like wind chimes. "Right away, my lord. Right away." They walked down the damp stone corridor. The air smelled of mold and despair. At the last cell, Higgins unlocked the iron door and swung it open. Tess Miller was sitting on the narrow cot. She hadn't slept. Her eyes were red and swollen, her face pale. She looked up, expecting the bailiff or the hangman. Instead, she saw them. "William!" The scream tore from her throat. She fell to her knees as William ran into the cell. They collided in a heap of embrace, Tess's hands frantically checking him. His face, his arms, his hair, making sure he was real, making sure he was whole. "I thought I lost you," she sobbed, kissing his forehead, his cheeks. "I thought I lost you forever." "He came for me," William said, his voice small but proud. He pointed to the doorway. "Papa came." Tess froze. She looked up. Alistair stood in the doorway, filling the frame. He was dirty, bloodied, and exhausted, but to Tess he looked like a weary angel. "Papa," she whispered, the question hanging in the dank air. Alistair stepped into the cell. He didn't care about the filth. He knelt beside them. He reached out and took Tess's hand, his bruised fingers intertwining with hers. "No more lies, Tess," Alistair said, his voice cracking. "No more shadows. I am done hiding him. And I am done hiding you." "But the lady," Tess stammered. "She will destroy us." Alistair's expression hardened, his jaw setting like granite. "She has tried, and she has failed. She will never hurt either of you again." He stood up, pulling Tess and William with him. "Where are we going?" Tess asked, looking down at her ragged dress. "I cannot go back to the cottage. The village. They will know I was arrested." "Let them talk," Alistair said. He led them out of the cell, past the gaping magistrate, and into the sunlight of the street. A crowd had gathered. The baker, the blacksmith, the gossip mongers. They stared at the Marquess, holding the hand of the miner's widow, the bastard boy standing between them. Alistair didn't hurry. He lifted William onto the saddle of Notros. He offered his hand to Tess. She hesitated, looking at the crowd, then at him. She saw the strength in his eyes, the absolute refusal to be ashamed. She took his hand. He swung her up behind the saddle. Alistair mounted the horse, sitting behind them, his arms encircling both mother and son. "To the manor," Alistair commanded the horse. They rode through the village, not as a scandal, but as a procession. And for the first time in 6 years, Alistair Blackwood breathed free air. The fallout was, as predicted, catastrophic for the polite society of Derbyshire. When Lady Rosalind Blackwood returned from her visit to her sister's estate 3 days later, she found the gates of Blackwood Manor locked. Silas, the butler, met her at the carriage window. He did not bow. He handed her a letter. It was brief, written in Alistair's heavy hand. It detailed the evidence of her crimes, the payments to Creech found in her desk, the testimony of the stable hands. It offered her a choice, a quiet exile to a small, drafty estate in the Scottish Highlands with a modest allowance, or a public trial for conspiracy to commit murder. Rosalind, pale and trembling with rage, chose the Highlands. She left that afternoon and never set foot in Oakhaven again. She died 20 years later, alone, surrounded by cats and bitterness. The legal battle for the annulment took a year. It was the scandal of London. The newspapers called it the peer and the peasant. Alistair was shunned by his clubs. He was sneered at in the House of Lords. He did not care. He spent that year at Oakhaven, watching William learn to ride Notros, watching Tess learn to run a great house. He watched the colour return to Tess's cheeks, and he watched the fear fade from William's eyes. On a bright, crisp morning in May 1850, the bells of the village church rang out. It was not a grand society wedding. There were no dukes or earls in attendance. The pews were filled with tenant farmers, villagers, and the staff of the manor, people who judged a man by his actions, not his lineage. Alistair stood at the altar, wearing a simple mourning suit. He watched Tess walk down the aisle. She wore a dress of pale blue silk, flowers woven into her hair. She looked radiant, not with the haughty beauty of a debutante, but with the warm, resilient beauty of a woman who had survived the storm. Standing beside Alistair, as his best man, was William, now 8 years old, standing tall and proud. When the vicar asked for the ring, William placed it in his father's hand. Alistair looked down at the boy, his son, acknowledged and claimed before God and the world. "With this ring," Alistair said, sliding the gold band onto Tess's finger, his voice thick with emotion, "I thee wed. With my body I thee worship, and with all my worldly goods I thee endow." He kissed her, and a cheer went up from the villagers that shook the stained glass. It was said that the Blackwood line changed that day. The coldness that had plagued the family for generations vanished, replaced by a warmth and vitality, that made Oakhaven the envy of the county. William Blackwood grew into a formidable man. He inherited his father's title and his mother's heart. He became a reformer in Parliament, fighting for the rights of the poor, a man who never forgot the smell of the river or the warmth of the cottage. And every year, on the anniversary of the storm, Alistair and Tess would walk down to the new stone bridge over the River Dart. They would stand there, holding hands, watching the water rush by, thankful for the flood that had washed away the lies and left them with the only thing that mattered: truth and love. And that, my friends, is how the Marquess of Oakhaven risked his title, his reputation, and his life to save the son he loved. In a time when class was everything, Alistair Blackwood chose family over duty. It makes you wonder, how many other secrets are buried in the history books? How many other noblemen had hearts that beat for people the world told them to ignore? I have to ask you, do you think Alistair was right to lie for so long? Or should he have claimed William from the start? And what about Lady Rosalind? Did she deserve her fate? Or was she just a product of a cruel system? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story of betrayal, redemption, and forbidden love, please smash that like button. It really helps the channel. And don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss another scandalous tale from history. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.